Early in 1945, the Timberwolf Division of the American First Army fought its way into Cologne, the capital of the Rhineland, and after Berlin, the largest city in Germany. The destruction was unbelievable. Although miraculously, the famous cathedral survived, its twin towers standing out like skeletal fingers above the rubble. Like this once beautiful city, all Germany went down with the Nazis into the pit. But Cologne recovered, and miraculously too, Germany was reborn. In the face of disaster, her people found the courage and resilience to rise out of the pit, led by a man of Cologne, Konrad Adenauer. In January 1955, Konrad Adenauer entered his 80th year, a birthday celebrated with a typical mixture of family propriety and civic dignity. He was to live on to the age of 91. He was known as Der Alte, the old man, and his life had spanned all of modern German history. For the Nazis, Cologne was an important prize. When they came to power in 1933, they at once took over the city. Adenauer had made no secret of his opposition to Hitler, and it seemed his active political life was then over. Adenauer had become Lord Mayor of Cologne in 1917 at the age of 41. For 16 years, he served the city diligently, at the same time taking an active part in the politics of the Weimar Republic, which replaced the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Under the Nazis, he was lucky to escape with his life. In 1944, he was rounded up in one of the last Gestapo purges and confined in miserable conditions, expecting to be shot. When the war ended, there were few like him left alive in Germany.
The fates made an odd choice in Konrad Adenauer. He was not a man of his times, certainly not the Hitler times, or perhaps of the Weimar Republic. His real base was the Imperial Civil Service of Wilhelmine Germany. When I first met him in 1948 during the Berlin blockade, I was tremendously impressed by a number of things. The first was his Catholicism, which to him was not simply religious, but part of a political attitude. The second was his probity and integrity. No one could doubt that this man believed what he said, that he was not the servant of expediency or opportunism. And finally, there was another attribute that became clearer as time went on. Adenauer understood, as very few German politicians, or indeed Germans of any position did, the tremendous destruction in Germany. The loss of economic life, the loss of social cohesion. He not only understood that, but he also understood that Germany had to find her way back into the European community. Both these objectives he set himself to accomplish, and both in time he did accomplish.
Words can hardly describe Germany's condition at the end of the war, nor the attitude of the victorious powers towards her.
The concentration camps had just been emptied. Auschwitz, Belsen, and the fruits of what the Nazis had done had been on everybody's newsreel, in every newspaper. And people knew this and were appalled. They had heard about it before, but until you saw, as I did, living skeletons, the enormity of the thing didn't come home to you.
Among those who reported on what they saw was the American writer Clare Boothe Luce.
The responsibility for these terrible crimes, for the excruciating sufferings and the agonized deaths of hundreds and thousands of men and women and children too in these camps, this responsibility falls squarely on the German people. They have long borne that responsibility in the eyes of God. They must be made now to bear it in the eyes of their fellow men.
No German could feign ignorance of what had been going on. In the big cities, films of Nazi atrocities were shown in movie houses, while in the countryside, work parties drawn from neighboring villages were organized at gunpoint to undertake the grim task of clearing up the death camps.
Adenauer, of course, knew as well as anybody in his position could the dreadful things that the Nazis were doing. He'd been arrested. He'd been in a detention camp waiting for execution. He believed, I think, that Germany had to purge herself of what the German leaders at least had done. He was not one of those who believed the whole German people were responsible for doing these things, but he thought they were responsible for turning their heads away and letting them happen. As he once said, their tolerance of evil.
At Nuremberg, the Nazis' crimes were formally indicted before the world and for posterity.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring, the International Military Bill sentences you to death by hanging. Defendant Rudolf Hess, the tribunal sentences you to imprisonment for life.
Immediate post-war Germany was marked by complete economic stagnation, a traumatic feeling by the rest of Europe against the Germans. And then you had on the Germans themselves this complete military reversal, their leaders in prison or dead, destroyed at home and detested abroad. And this is a situation that Konrad Adenauer took on and out of which he fashioned modern Germany.
The defeat of Germany had been the only bond uniting the Western democracies and the Soviet Union. When the victors met in Berlin, they were already in disagreement about the future administration of the defeated nation. As attitudes hardened into the Cold War, new boundaries were drawn across Germany where the armies had halted. Berliners found themselves marooned behind the Soviet lines under joint Allied control. Beginning with Cologne, which fell within the British zone of occupation, Adenauer went on to draw up plans for a new Germany. They centered on the formation of the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, a new political party which became Adenauer's means for achieving power once free political activity was allowed again. In their part of Germany, the Soviets immediately forced politics into the Stalinist mold and tried to discredit what they could not control. The rival systems clashed in Berlin, which Adenauer shrewdly refused to make his base. Berlin, he knew, was too vulnerable to outside pressures. In June 1948, it seemed indeed as if Berlin would shortly fall into Stalin's hands when the Soviets abruptly cut all surface links with the West. At this very moment, the three Western occupying powers were planning to unify their zones. They responded to Stalin's blockade with a massive airlift.
Had it not been for two things, first, the ability of the Americans and the British to organize an airlift, and secondly, the stationing of a group of American and British atomic bombers in Britain, Stalin might well have won the day. But the blockade had another effect. The West Berliners did more than anyone could have asked for them. They went out there and they unloaded planes. There were a lot of people killed in the Berlin blockade, and the majority were West Berliners. And in so doing, I believe they won West Germany's passport back into Europe.
The blockade ended in May 1949, and Berliners celebrated it as a victory. Meanwhile, under Adenauer's direction, a parliamentary council had produced a constitution for West Germany. After the ensuing elections in August 49, Adenauer became the first chancellor of the new German Federal Republic.
There were a series of measures and a series of meetings through which Germany became accepted as an economic and military partner in Europe. Largely due, I think, to Adenauer's adroit exploitation of the situation, Eden's belief that Germany could be rearmed through Western European unity, the drive to get Germany into NATO, and Adenauer's reluctance to go in if Germany was not sovereign, which is what he really wanted.
Under Adenauer's guidance, the Parliamentary Council had chosen Bonn as the new seat of government.
He thought that Bonn would be the ideal capital. Adenauer lived at Rohendorf, which was hard by. He was what he would call a West Prussian. He thought that Frankfurt was too vulnerable. It is very close to the East German frontier. He thought that Munich was not representative, and he thought that Hamburg was not representative, and that Bonn was in the center of the Catholic Rhineland.
In power in his own country, Adenauer now turned to the international field.
Ich bin der britischen Regierung außerordentlich dankbar für die Einladung nach London.
I'm very grateful to His Majesty's government for the invitation to come to London.
Ich hoffe von Herzen, dass die Unterredungen...
With the Korean War at its height, Adenauer's Germany was numbered among the friends of the West. Then, in June 1953, the workers of East Berlin rose against their communist masters. The flare-up quickly spread throughout East Germany in a violent repudiation of the austerity and repression which Soviet propaganda made out was to be preferred to conditions in West Germany. Soviet troops had to be called in, and a massive purge followed. German reunification was as far off as ever. 1953 was election year in West Germany. The central figure was Adenauer himself. Parties and principles counted for less than the personality of the old man who had made Germany acceptable again in the West.
Adenauer was at the age when most men would have retired, but he chose a life of ceaseless activity because, again, he had this inner belief that the job had to be done, that a new Germany had to be born, and that he and his vehicle were the means by which it should be born. He fought on and won a Germany which was a Christian democratic Germany.
In 1953, Adenauer paid his first official visit to America. In Washington, the playing of the old German national anthem gave him the satisfaction of knowing that his federal republic, though not yet 4 years old, was judged to have come of age. It was a tribute to his own undeviating internationalism.
Well, Adenauer once said that today I regard myself primarily as a European and only secondarily as a German. Now, that was the key to almost everything he did in international affairs during his chancellorship. He had seen, and I think as a lot of other people did, that Western Europe as a group of independent nations could not stand up against the threat of the Soviet Union plus its allies.
Wir haben einen klaren Weg vor uns. Wir werden diesen Weg gehen.
So that modern European unity, which is based on the common market and secondly, militarily, on NATO, owes a great deal to what Adenauer did in those very difficult years.
Adenauer's greatest political achievement now approached. Full sovereignty would give West Germany the right to rearm. To bury forever the specter of German militarism Her armed forces would be integrated in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Adenauer came to Paris for the fateful meeting.
Au cours des jours prochains, l'entrée de la République fédérale d'Allemagne dans l'Union de l'Europe occidentale, où est traité de l'Atlantique Nord, va devenir réalité.
Certainly, Adenauer saw the thing very clearly. He once said to me that the West must decide on which is the greater danger. The danger posed by the Soviet Union and its allies on one hand against the West, or the danger of a German contingent in a Western European army.
The entry of the German Federal Republic into NATO is indeed a historic event. As my predecessor, Sir Anthony Eden, so often emphasized, NATO is an intimate but not an exclusive organization. And I think that many of us would have wished him to be here today to witness personally the culmination of a policy to which he made so great a contribution. That is the policy of bringing the Federal Republic into the free association of sovereign states.
Recruiting for the new German army began at once, less than 10 years since Hitler's war machine had been smashed.
One of the basic problems that Adenauer had when it became evident that the Western Allies wanted Germany rearmed, was to sell it in Germany. There was no great militarist feeling in Germany at that time. There was, however, a feeling eventually that Adenauer drilled into them that you are getting protection, you must make your own contribution.
Keine Experimente, weil sie das deutsche Volk von...
Well, as a politician, Adenauer was a tough fighter, but he had certain rules he abided by. Never tell a lie, because your lies will catch up with you. And secondly, of course, never attack somebody who's not there. But if he is there, go after him, and go after him as hard as you can. And that's why I think he was so effective in the Bundestag.
No sooner had Adenauer won recognition of West Germany's sovereignty than he set off for Moscow on an equally difficult mission.
The socialists had always attacked him as being a servant of the West and anti-Russian. Both the socialists and his own party said that there were X thousand German prisoners still in the Soviet Union, which the Russians said did not exist. Why can't they come home? And Adenauer made this pilgrimage to Moscow, which I would think intellectually and morally cost him a great deal, because he had a low view of the Russians. But he did make the trip. It was successful, and he got them back.
Less than 10,000 prisoners of war returned, and many waited in vain for a long-lost husband, father, or brother. In the intervening 10 years, perhaps 500,000, perhaps 1 million Germans had perished in Soviet camps. Another pilgrimage came more easily to Adenauer. Dismayed at occasional signs that anti-Semitism still existed, he went out of his way to demonstrate Germany's break with its Nazi past.
He early understood the link between the United States and Israel. But he also had an emotional feeling as a Christian and as a Catholic that some retribution must be made by Germany to Israel or to the Jewish people. And in doing so, restored people's faith in Germany and in Germans.
In August 1961, Berlin again hit the headlines. By then, nearly 3 million East Germans had sought refuge in the West. Their escape route was through Berlin. The Soviet answer was the Berlin Wall, which effectively sealed off the Soviet sector of the city and cut the flow of refugees to a trickle of daring individuals.
The building of the Berlin Wall really was a backhand tribute to Adenauer and the policy of the West. But one of the most ingenious and heavily armed fences in the world runs from the Baltic right down to the Czech frontier. Built at a cost of about 1 million marks a mile by the East Germans. at their own expense to keep the East Germans in. So the wall is just one part of this whole system, and the whole system is a tribute, in a way, to Adenauer and to Western democracy.
Behind the East Germans lay the Red Army and their Soviet-style Gestapo. Adenauer's Germany was now rich and strong and free, a major partner in NATO, a bulwark of the West. Adenauer continued in office until 1963, but he was reluctant even then to relinquish power.
Adenauer's philosophy of power, as I saw it, was that power used for what he regarded as national and rational objectives was correct. That there should never be too much power invested in one man, because being Adenauer, he thought that I may be perfect, but my successors may not be. I think that Adenauer's was one of the great political achievements of this century. Perhaps in its way, a greater achievement than Bismarck's, because Bismarck was building on strength, and Adenauer built on weakness. He took a country broken economically and outcast politically and brought it back into the concert of Europe as a strong and powerful and loyal member of the great concept of Europe in this century. Now, partly this was due to his own personal ambition, his own personal desire for power. Not an ignoble desire, because he believed that he, and only he, would be able to bring Germany back to something approaching her former position. But he accomplished far more than anyone could have thought in 1948. And indeed, if you want his monument, look at modern Germany. It is his Germany still.